Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm very proud to present to you today the distinguished American Dr. Henry Kissinger. Would you please join me in welcoming him?
All right. Well, Dr. Kissinger, let me begin by saying what a thrill it is to be here with the Babe Ruth of international statesmen. And I want to begin at the beginning, and that is you started out your academic career at Harvard, but in studying it seems like you were always looking toward becoming a player in international affairs and not just a mere commentator. So beginning with a PhD, give us what it was that put your sights on being on the playing field and not just a commentator on the sidelines.
Actually, I didn't start out that way. When I came to this country in 1938, I had to go to work in a shaving brush factory, and I went to school at night, and I was studying accounting in City College in New York. Then in the Army, it's where I got the commitment to try to do public service at some point. And then under the GI Bill of Rights, I went to Harvard. Now, I didn't have a fixed plan how to get into public service. And I usually tell my students who want to get into public service, do what interests you most any year in what you're studying. And if you write something significant, sooner or later they'll find you. That if you try to plot it, in my life, I was appointed National Security Advisor by Richard Nixon, whom I had never met. And I had been Foreign Policy Advisor to Nelson Rockefeller, who was the principal opponent of Nixon. So I don't think you can plan public service. What you can do is reflect about where the country should go and what contribution you might make, and then let life take care of it.
Well, you've certainly done a good job of that. Talking about your service with President Nixon, in your book, Years of Upheaval, you said there was no true Nixon. There were several warring personalities which struggled for preeminence in the same individual. Obviously, there was a very good Nixon and there was a bad Nixon. And fortunately, you connected with the good Nixon with all your foreign achievements. But did you ever figure out who or what was motivating the bad Nixon?
No, I never saw the bad Nixon. And I don't accept the general media notion. I think Nixon was a distinguished president who performed great service for the country. He suffered from some personal insecurities, and that made his human relationships more complex than they should have been. And in order to balance those, he sometimes did things that trying to avoid direct personal confrontations, things of that nature. But if you look at the actual decisions that he made, in both the domestic and foreign policy, he had a principle that was you pay the same price for doing something halfway as for doing it completely. So you might as well do it completely. And I really urge people to look at what he did and not at these debates about Watergate, which was a collection of petty, stupid things, and some of which he wasn't even directly involved. So at any rate, I think Nixon will be seen over time as an important president.
Well, on the subject of great international leadership, in your book, Diplomacy, you say that top political leadership involves bridging the gap between experience and vision, which requires an instinctive grasp of historical currents, and also requires being bold enough to operate at the limit of what a situation permits. So using your definition, not including yourself, who do you regard as the 2 or 3 top political leaders in the world over the last 50 years?
That I have been able to observe. De Gaulle,
De Gaulle?
Mandela, Sadat, Franklin Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt. I'm just applying criteria you gave, but saying necessarily I'd vote for it.
Well, why don't you give us a few sentences, for example, about
Mao was
Mao?
well, he is responsible for many dead, but I'm just saying in terms of the impact on the world and the society.
Now, going back to the time you spent as President Nixon's national security advisor, obviously one of the greatest challenges was you being the lead negotiator to bring us out of the Vietnam War. And on behalf of all people my age, I want to thank you for bringing us out of the Vietnam War. But from your perspective, after you succeeded in getting us extricated, what was it that caused South Vietnam to fall as fast as it did after the U.S. had removed itself from the war?
But to me, the tragedy of the whole experience in Vietnam was that America entered that war for the absolutely best of motives. It wanted to achieve in Asia what we had achieved in Europe, namely to keep countries out of the control of communist pressures. And the administrations who got us involved, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, did not estimate correctly that the challenge in Vietnam was different than Europe, because Vietnam had no history of being a state. So a state had to be built in the middle of a civil war. And then, sometime in that process, America turned on itself. And the issue of the Vietnam War became a huge debate on the theory that the government was somehow guilty and you had to pressure the government. Now, I saw and worked with Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and nobody had a greater incentive to get out of the war than the President of the United States. But we were dealing with an adversary. We Americans, approached the issue as a search for compromise. The Vietnamese compromise was defeat. So they wanted to bring down the South Vietnamese political structure. Now, by 72, we had achieved a position where they, and in the negotiations that I conducted, which were sort of a nightmare because they would read to me statements from the Senate and from the New York Times, and I would say, here is our position, and I'd say, we don't have to pay attention to that. Somebody has already offered more. Well, but finally by 72, end of 72, we got an agreement. Could that agreement have lasted? Who knows? We thought it could. But then came Watergate, and the Congress cut the budget for Vietnam from $2.5 billion to $700 million at a time when oil prices were quadrupling. So that the Vietnamese army had to ration artillery shells and limit flights. Then the Congress prohibited any American military action in support of the agreement. Well, if you make an agreement that you're not willing to enforce, that's a kind of surrender. So I look back to Vietnam with great sadness, because the country should never be that divided. The vast majority of Americans, if they had understood what we were up against, would have come, I think, to very similar conclusions. Our basic view was we will be very flexible on military things, but we will not turn over people who, in reliance on the American word, have chosen our side. We will not turn them over to the communists. If they want to vote themselves being communists somewhere down the line, that's their problem. So I think right now Vietnam is not being taught at universities in any objective way. Someday we really have to ask ourselves how we came to split our country so much. And administrations have a responsibility, but the way the outside community did this is, in my view, why Vietnam collapsed so quickly. Could it have maintained itself indefinitely? I don't know that. Maybe not, but maybe it could have gone the way South Korea did. It certainly has the resources.
Now, you were one of our first foreign policy experts to recognize that America has limits on what it can do in international affairs. And obviously our nation's ambitions exceeded our military commitment and probably our political will in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. So why does America keep entering wars that it doesn't know how to end?
Because we have a tendency.
We what?
We have a tendency to deal with foreign policy as a missionary enterprise, and that we define our purpose as transforming the world to our principles. And as a general objective, that is, of course, what we prefer. But when you apply it to concrete cases, then you have to ask yourself, what the limits are of what America can do. When you take Iraq, you have a Shia, a third of the country is Shia, a third of the country is Sunni, a third of the country is Kurds. They were put together into a single country only in 1920 by the British, who wanted to block Iran and they wanted to block the Arab national resurgence. And they had no specific idea how to make a country out of this. Now, our objectives in Iraq were absolutely noble, but the Shia and Sunni have been fighting each other since the 9th century. That's a religious conflict. And the Kurds are yet another group that has been striving for independence. So when we go in there then and make a military occupation, on the whole, we've actually been fairly successful in what you could do in a 10-year period. But then the American public's support ran out of it. So I agree with the drift of your question, which is, if I understand it correctly, we have fought 4 wars, which we entered with great enthusiasm. All of these wars were fought with 80% public support initially. And then we didn't know how to end them. And the reason we didn't know how to end them was because we did not translate our general objectives into political objectives that could lead to a successful negotiation, or we didn't understand properly the extent of thinking of the other side. So one of the big tasks in front of our country now is to recognize 2 things. One, for many issues in the world, we are still indispensable. But in exercising our influence, we have to divide these issues intellectually into those which are so important to us that we would have to do them alone if necessary. And then into issues that are important to us, but which we can't succeed in carrying out unless there's widespread support. Mm-hmm. And finally, into issues that, while they're significant, we can't do. And so we have to start this way. Second thing, in my opinion, we have to learn is we have these wars with which we had trouble. Were fought in the interior of Asia along front lines where the enemy would win if it only survived. The enemy didn't have to do anything except survive. So time was totally on their side. We have to come to a more peripheral strategy in which we maximize our geographic position. If you look at how Wellington defeated Napoleon, it wasn't in the center of the continent at first, it was at the very edge of the continent. So these are general observations. But also when you talk of American failures, you have to talk about American successes. So we won the Cold War. We restored Europe. The international system is more or less following market principle maxims. But we became too enthusiastic about the engineering we could do in countries like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
Which brings us to Syria. Obviously, that's a hot situation. Last week you said America should do what we can short of using ground forces. But with over 70,000 killed and over 1 million people having fled the country in the last year, and now Iran stepping up with substantial military assistance to the Syrian government, if you're President of the United States today, what steps would you take regarding the Syrian crisis?
The first step I take is to get the smartest people I can find to analyze the problem and tell me what is the issue here. And I think you will come to, they will come to this conclusion. When this process started, a lot of American attention was focused on how to get rid of Assad, as if it were a question of an individual. Now, the thing to remember about Assad is he started in life as an ophthalmologist. I'm sure he's sitting in Damascus now, mourning the day when his father pulled him out of his ophthalmology practice in London because his older brother had been killed in an automobile accident. So he represents, he's not an individual, he represents the Alawite minority, Shia minority, that has been governing in Syria since the 70s. And they supplied most of the officers in the army. So it's really an ethnic struggle between Alawites on the one hand, Sunnis on the other, and where most of the other minorities, including the Christians, are supporting the Alawites because they're afraid of Sunni domination. So when you look at an ethnic conflict, of course you could say if you put in overpowering force, you might be able to get it under control, but you then might also be, as in Iraq, in the middle of a civil war of all against all. So I think we have, what is our national interest? We certainly have an American national interest to prevent Iran from emerging out of this as a dominant country in Syria. And so I would support anything by which we support forces that fight the Iranians. On the outcome, what is most conducive to our principles would be an outcome in which every ethnic group can lead a certain autonomous existence and comes together in a benign central government. But that, when you say that, during World War II, allegedly somebody said the way to solve the submarine problem is to heat the ocean and boil them to the surface. And somebody said, how do you do that? He said, I've given you the idea, the technical implementation. It's up to you. So as a general rule, I think we should, if we can identify ethnic groups that support an outcome like I've described, I'm favored supporting them. Mm-hmm. What I don't think we should do is to get into another open-ended commitment where we put military forces into a country which is in the midst of a civil war that has gone on for a long time. And we try with American sacrifices to do that, that will end like Afghanistan. And so what we should do, I think in Syria, Russia could be helpful because the fear of Russia is they have 30 million Muslims in their country. And their fear is that if radicalism spreads too much in Syria, it will reach their country very fast. So can we get together with the Europeans and Russia to come up with some guiding principles? And can we find groups that after success will govern according to these principles? But if we can't do these things, then I know it's a tragedy, but we can't solve every tragedy by American military presence on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Now, when most people hear the name Kissinger, the first word that comes to mind is China and the diplomatic revolution that you and President Nixon engineered there. Earlier this week, new Chinese President Xi said his number one priority is for China to surpass the U.S. as the world's top military power, and he predicted a marathon contest for global dominion. What's your reaction to that statement for global dominion at a time when our congressmen in Washington, D.C. are aggressively pursuing ways to cut America's defense budget?
Xi is a newly installed president in a country who probably almost certainly has less power than the American president, in the sense that he can't just walk into his office and order something. It's a country that is run by a constellation of various constituencies in which Xi is clearly the dominant figure. So I always, when I see these speeches, want to see what audience is he addressing. But let's talk about it conceptually. In the history of the world, when you have a country that is rising, like China, and a country that's well established, like the United States, it very often leads to conflict. And many people say World War I started because Germany rose and Britain was there, and the established countries and the new country went to war. And it's true. But then you'd have to ask yourself, if the people who went to war in 1914 had known what the world would look like in 1918, would they have ever gone to war? I doubt it. So here we have with China a country with a different culture, considerable development, and can they outdo us in a military way? I can't conceive it. But if they try to do this, we will have a conflict-ridden period. I think we should attempt, and that will work only if they'll join us, to see whether in a world in which there are so many problems to be solved, we can evolve a cooperative model. From a purely military point of view, it's very hard to see how either country would really defeat the other. But when you have energy, non-proliferation, the cyber issues, which really is a shorthand for all the new technologies that are developing. I think a cooperative effort is needed to see whether they can be solved. If China really does what their president has said, and they'd have a long way to go, then of course we will resist. And we would resist from a very strong position. Because look, here is a country that right now has to move 400 million people from the countryside to the cities. They have, by their own terms, a significant problem of corruption. They have to move the center of gravity of their country from the coast into the interior. And to do all of this in the midst of a military-type conflict with the United States would be very short-sighted from their point of view. So I think we should know what our national interest is. And our national interest is that we will not permit the hegemony of any country in the world. But we also should recognize that we are living in a new world. Look how the energy pattern has changed, in which the significance of the Middle East is diminishing because of our own development of energy sources in our own country. So I think we should trust on our own evolution, and if military conflicts are necessary, we'll of course do it. But first we should try to construct a more peaceful international system.
Now, during the lunch, I don't know if you saw it or not, we had many photographs of you with a number of Israeli and Arab leaders over the last several decades. And of course, we're mindful of your success in ending the Yom Kippur War by playing a lead role in initiating meetings to bring to fruition a resolution through shuttle diplomacy. Now, let's again assume that today it's President Kissinger. Would you be taking the lead in getting discussions going between the Israeli and Palestinian leaders in hopes of brokering a settlement?
Well, in 1973, when I was active and started a number of these processes, the situation was that the people armed by the United States had won the war. So that if those people who wanted a change realized that we were the key to a solution, that gave us a very strong bargaining position. In the present world, we have the Arab Spring, which is started as a expression of local resentments, but has now brought in every country into key positions the Muslim Brotherhood, which for decades has dedicated itself to an anti-Western, pro-Sharia type, so that the objective conditions, the calculations people make, have become more uncertain. Still, I think an effort should be made to promote a Palestinian-Israeli negotiation. Question is whether we should aim at a negotiation that settles everything all at once, or whether we should go step by step. I, on the whole, have preferred step by step, because when you want to do the whole thing, and you want to get guarantees and verification of every aspect, it gets so complicated and so dependent on domestic changes that it often blows up in your face. But I would be open-minded, and I think it is a worthwhile effort for the administration to support that process.
For my last question, before we get to questions from the audience, we have to talk about Iran, a country that's bedeviled the United States now for several decades. And you've said recently several times that the next 12 months are crucial and that President Obama has important decisions and policies and strategies that he needs to implement involving this very volatile situation. So again, let's assume we got President Kissinger instead of President Obama. What do you do during the next 12 months about that situation?
Because you'd have to change the Constitution to make it changes.
All right, that's a minor issue. Let's assume we've gotten past that.
Look, I'm often described as a realist, but I think that is not a good way of looking at these things. The right way to look at these problems is to say, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to prevent? And what are the facts in the case? Mm-hmm. Which you would do as a lawyer. Mm-hmm. Now, the facts in the case are these. For at least 15 years, the United States and its allies have said that that a Iranian nuclear military capability is intolerable. They have said it is unacceptable. But they've never exactly defined what they mean by unacceptable and what they mean by military capability. There are three elements to a military strategic capability: delivery systems, fissile material, and warheads. The Iranians have done the delivery systems. I mean, they are out of control. And they are very hard to stop. So now they are in the phase of acquiring fissile material. That is the most difficult part. And then to make a warhead is relatively easy if you have all the fissile material. So when I say something has to be decided in the next 12 months, I mean this. That if this process goes on for much longer, and scientists would have to tell you the exact number, Iran could accumulate so much fissile material that they could go at any moment to the warhead thing, just like the Koreans have been doing and did. If that happens, this will change the situation in the region completely, because then other countries will do their utmost to buy or build nuclear weapons. So those are the stakes. Now, the issue is we are engaged in a negotiation. So we have to look at this negotiation to see, are we making a progress that enables us to say we have stopped the enrichment process at a point where they could not get nuclear weapons except by a huge violation extended over a long period of time. And I think we're getting very close to a point where this point will be reached. So then the president has to decide whether to step up sanctions, use other pressures, or whether to make some settlement along whatever lines he was. And I'm bothered by the fact, if you compare the original position the United States took 15 years ago with where we are now, you could come to the conclusion as an Iranian that rejecting American proposals doesn't cost you much because you get a better offer every time there's a new negotiation. It's a very tough decision that has to be made, and we have to remember in making it not to get ourselves into another open-ended conflict, but that's where I think we stand. And that's why I say we can't carry this process as a negotiation much further without either getting an agreement or a significant increase in pressure.
Jim Falk?
Thomas, thank you so much. And you can imagine the number of questions that we've received from the audience, and we just have time for one or two more. And many of them have asked about, Dr. Kissinger, what really worries you the most that affects our national interest in world security? And there were many questions about the changes in North Korea and the recent aggressive posture of the new leader.
Let me make one attempt. It's in the essence of a discussion like we're having that you talk about problems, because you're bound to ask questions of things that bother you. But if you ask yourself for the future of the world over the next 30 years, why would the United States not be able to be at the beginning of a great period rather than at the beginning of the change in the energy production, which to us, I mean, we look at it as a daily story. But if we become self-sufficient or substantially self-sufficient in energy, the significance of some of the regions in the world whose troubles have been able to blackmail us will be significantly different. And we know that the manufacturing sector in the United States can pick up significantly when our energy costs go down as they will. So, and if you look around the world, whose hand would you rather play than the American world? So I am actually optimistic about the long-term trends. But then what worries me most at the moment, you mentioned North Korea. North Korea is an absolutely weird regime. It's not, I mean, communist regimes have a party and some kind of structure. The North Korean regime is a family enterprise run by one family in an unbelievably brutal manner. For example, here's a country, every house of which has a radio that the inhabitants cannot turn off so that the government can talk to them 24 hours a day. If you compare, North Korea used to be the industrial base for Korea. You compare North Korea and South Korea. South Korea is a basket, North Korea is a basket case in almost every respect, except that at the cost of horrible famines, they have managed to build a few nuclear weapons. And their conduct of international affairs is based on irrationality, so they threaten they will go to war. I don't think they have enough reserves to go to war for more than 2 weeks. This is not a strong country. It's a ruthless country that if it fires artillery into Seoul, could do huge damage. And I'm not worried about its nuclear weapons, certainly not vis-a-vis us. One of the dangers is, however, it's a country that matters a great deal to China, to Japan, and now to us. I could imagine that if the North Korean regime collapses one day, that then the attempt by China, US, Russia, everybody to try to calibrate this could lead to a very dangerous situation. So this is something that we ought to address. The capacity of North Korea to threaten anyone for more than a suicide attack is, in my opinion, extremely limited. But it's an extremely ruthless regime. But it's not a very strong regime. It's huge suffering, which they exact by terror. But it's a subject on which the surrounding countries really ought to come to some understanding and not let themselves be sucked into a conflict by this really irresponsible bunch of leaders.
We have a last question, and I'd like to remind the audience to remain seated because we'll have a short presentation at the end of the program. Dr. Kissinger, so much has changed in the role of the media since when you were Secretary of State. How has those changes affected the conduct of foreign policy now?
Well, you know, I hate to be nostalgic about the role of media. We had a tough time with the media that existed at that period. The way the media have changed in that period is when I first came into government, there was the evening news, and that was really the key television event about news. Now you have a news cycle 24 hours a day, and the presenters have to get your attention, so they have to recycle crises, and then they have to have controversy whose essential nature is rarely explained, so that the level of concern of the public is heightened, but it's not focused on anything sufficiently concrete. In the writing world, and God knows I did not enjoy that either, but still there were a few columnists who were doing serious work over extended periods of time. I don't know any columnist who today would have that degree of influence. So the shift to 24-hour news cycle. And another thing is the way knowledge is acquired. When you read something, you have to put it into some concept to retain it in your mind, because otherwise. But when you can acquire knowledge by pressing a button, you can always meet your immediate need by looking it up on Google. And then you can forget it and think you can go back to this. So then the total impact of that is less conceptual understanding. But the real knowledge, in my opinion at least, consists of getting a view of how you go from where you are to where you haven't been. And you can't look that up. You can only acquire that. And when in studies of statesmen that I have concern myself with. The people who have been best are the ones who had a sense of history. And our society now is getting deprived of that to some extent. But again, on the positive side, there are so many technical means of addressing what I've described that once it's recognized, and I don't want to leave you with a pessimistic impression. I've described problems because I was asked about problems. If you ask me for the overall situation, if we straighten out our own thinking, this could be the beginning of a great period for America, another period of retreat. That to be my basic message to you.
And that is a wonderful message for us to thank you and to end on. Dr. Kissinger, thank you for the contributions you've made to our nation's history. Now, Dr. Kissinger, again, stand there. Now, Dr. Kissinger, our member, and again, I'd like to ask you to remain in the room for a moment. Dr. Kissinger, our members know that I often give a tie. Once I gave one to General Petraeus, and I said, "Sir, I cannot have your stars, but I can give you my tie." And we're going to give you a tie, but we also know that you are a sports fan, and so is your family. So we have a baseball autographed for you from Nolan Ryan, one of our hometown heroes. Let us keep that.
He's a big fan of you.
And then we also know of your love of football, soccer, and so we have a jersey from the FC Dallas. And then, of course, to celebrate our new sponsorship with the Dallas Stars, so pleased that Matt Bowen is here to present you with the official Kissinger Dallas Stars shirt jersey.
Oh, my God.
We'll take all that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.